Here's a thought experiment for everybody in the audience today. What makes something in a game strong? Honest question. What makes something in any game powerful? The stats? Maybe. The effects? Yeah, could be. The damage, the utility, the infinite value of the thing? Possibly. But it all comes down to one thing. How much power is in the thing that you created? Here's what I mean. Power budgets. Power budgets, when it comes to designing anything, whether or not it's game design, whether or not it's tabletop role-playing games, whether or not it's card games, what have you. Power budget is an important aspect that you have to keep in mind in order to make a somewhat balanced item, a balanced product. And if you don't properly do that, you end up with scenarios where you're trying to get people, typically if you're doing this for 5th edition homebrew, which if you're coming to my channel you most likely are, if you're trying to convince people either online or your friends to try out your homebrew, you have to ask yourself a question. What is the power budget? And how do I know what my power budget is? Well, you have to think of it in relative terms. So, like I have said many times on this channel before, the marshals have a much lower power budget than anyone else. They have one of the lowest power budgets in the entire game, because they are given so few tools, so few things to do, that you can theoretically make them so strong, you could borderline give marshals overpowered wish-like abilities. This is obviously for hyperbole, but you could give them insanely powerful abilities on the same levels of 8th and 9th level spells that they still would be considered weaker than spellcasters in an alternate universe. Obviously you don't want to do that, because Wish is already a broken spell in and of itself, but the point remains. Your power budget is important. So starting out with a power budget is not something you can do. A power budget is something you have to think to yourself prior to writing anything down. So, here's an example. When I was writing and still am, when I was writing my monk class, my monk rework, I had proposed different ideas for how the key system could be reworked. And eventually I came to the chakra system, where it's yin and yang, thanks to Cybrock. And they swapped between the two, and you never really expend any of your chakra. It just gets swapped between the two. Now, that is what I would consider a pretty average power budget. Again, a pretty average amount of your power budget spent. It is a good change. It keeps the theme and the roleplay aspect of what was initially there, but it buffs it in a way that makes thematic sense and is more complicated, but in an easy to understand way. Instead of just having points that you spend, you have points that can swap between pools, and depending on which pool you have more of, gives you different benefits. So, now that begs the question, with the rest of this imaginary power budget, where do you want to go with the class? In my case, the monk as a baseline already had decent abilities, and a lot of them were ribbon features, which is fine. Ribbon features are very low power budget, if not basically free, because they don't do anything. So what you could do is you could take the existing abilities and buff them up to cost something to up your power budget. But where I wanted to focus most of my monk's power was in their maneuvers that they got. So that's what I did. I made the abilities that they get from the base class have a lower power budget than I think they should, and then as they got higher in levels, they got more powerful abilities, but they are still lower than what I personally would have given them at that time. But to compensate for that, all of their maneuvers for certain levels are stronger. So all of the power is in the maneuvers. So it incentivizes a gameplay style of the monk using their resources to use these strong abilities, because their base class has good features, but a lot of them don't facilitate a high damage playstyle like how I'm trying to convey with the monk. The way they perform martial arts with their maneuvers is how they should be made, how they should be functioning. And with that, the power budget, it hasn't been fully expended yet, but it has gotten to a point where the power budget is now somewhat on par, at least in my eyes, to a half-caster class, where they're not as powerful as a spellcaster, but they're getting there. And that's where I want to keep them. So when it comes to power budgeting, I would say see back to my video on how to make martial homebrews to get a better sense of the points I'm about to make, but figure out whether or not you want to be completely original, or you want to be inspired, or just straight up rip from other sources like 4th edition, 5th edition, 3.5, what have you. And then build upon that premise, give them a resource that they actually have to expend and think about using, give them abilities that they can use outside of just a basic attack, and then expand upon it so this way it encompasses the playstyle you want the class to have. The Barbarian is a high damage, somewhat tanky fighter. The fighter is meant to protect other people. The Ranger and the Rogue are high damage dealers and high mobility, but low health and low defenses. The Wizard has the lowest health and the lowest defenses, and it relies on its peers to protect him. But in contrast to that, it has the highest AoE damage. It has the highest amount of crowd control. And while somebody like the cleric doesn't have a lot of damage, and it does have some good damaging abilities, but it doesn't have a lot of damage compared to the damage dealers. It doesn't have the same crowd control as the Wizard, and it doesn't have the tanking ability of the fighter. So it's somewhere in between all three, so it's meant to cover whatever is left, typically supportive spells, supportive abilities, to facilitate the other two to protect them. So think about what kind of gameplay, I don't want to say gameplay loop, because that feels like you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, That's kind of what we want to steer away from. But for lack of a better term, think of the gameplay loop you want your class or your homebrew to have. What do you want to happen in every fight or every scenario that the class, subclass, item, when will these things be applicable? And how often do you as the dungeon master, or how often do you think your dungeon master will make these situations applicable? And if some of the answers are not really, or it's not going to come up a lot, or if it does come up, it's somebody else has already got it covered, then maybe think about putting more power into what is important in the class, or subclass, or item, and then dial back on the more situationally niche effects. So, that's my video on power budgeting. It's a little bit short, but it's really all I got to say about it. New video of homebrew review coming out soon. Going over the captain in Vault Aspire. Gonna go over all of the subclasses in another video. Go through all of their special feature in another video, and then I'll move on. I'm gonna get through all of Vault Aspire soon, hopefully, and keep you all posted.